Welcome. Tonight, we will journey together through the vast and fascinating history of the American frontier. From the earliest explorers to the closing of the frontier, we'll travel across open plains, rugged mountains, and untamed wilderness. All from the comfort of your own space, so relax, get cozy, and let the story of the American frontier gently carry you into sleep. Long before the world knew of bustling towns, iron rails, or towering cities stretching across the American continent, there was a vast, untamed wilderness. A land of rivers winding like silver threads, of forests so dense the sunlight could barely touch the forest floor, and of plains that seemed to stretch endlessly, rolling under the open sky. This was the world of the American frontier before the arrival of European eyes. It was a world shaped by nature, by the winds and waters, and by the people who called it home for countless generations. The indigenous peoples of this land lived in deep connection with their surroundings. From the icy regions of the north to the deserts of the southwest, from the lush forests of the east to the expansive plains in the middle, countless tribes and nations thrived. Each had its own culture, its own language, its own traditions and stories. They hunted and fished, farmed and gathered, and traveled the land with knowledge passed down through generations. The rivers were highways, the forests were medicine cabinets, and the animals were both sustenance and companions in a delicate balance of life. Life among the indigenous nations was not static, nor was it simple. They built communities that suited the land, villages made of wood, stone, or earth. They adapted to changing seasons, learned to read the movements of animals, and understood the cycles of nature in a way that allowed them to live in harmony with the vast land around them. Trade networks extended far beyond a single tribe's territory, and stories of creation, spirits, and the natural world were shared in song and ceremony, keeping the knowledge of centuries alive. Then, slowly, the world beyond the horizon began to intrude. In the 16th century, European explorers arrived, guided by curiosity, ambition, and the desire for wealth. The Spanish, driven by gold and the glory of empire, navigated the southern reaches of the continent. They traveled through deserts and mountains, leaving behind traces of their presence in missions, forts, and towns. Their journeys were perilous. Many explorers succumbed to hunger, disease, and the challenges of unknown lands. Yet their reports and maps would inspire generations to come. Farther north, the French sought the riches of fur and the promise of trade along the rivers and lakes. They built trading posts and engaged in complex relationships with the native nations. Unlike some of the Spanish expeditions, the French often sought cooperation, forming alliances, and sometimes intermarrying with indigenous peoples. They explored waterways that would later become vital to the settlement of the interior, documenting the landscapes, the people, and the abundance of life around them. The English, arriving along the Atlantic coast, established colonies that would grow into the first permanent settlements. These early colonies were often isolated and vulnerable. Settlers faced harsh winters, unfamiliar climates, and challenges in cultivating the land. Yet, the idea of the frontier, a land of opportunity beyond the known settlements, pulled them ever westward. Explorers ventured inland, mapping rivers, climbing hills, and noting the resources they found. Each journey into the unknown carried both promise and danger. Among these early explorers were men and women whose names would become part of history. Some were driven by ambition, some by scientific curiosity, and others by the simple desire to see what lay beyond the next horizon. They kept journals, sketched maps, and sent back letters filled with descriptions of vast forests, towering mountains, and rivers that seemed to flow endlessly. In these records, the land became more than wilderness. It became a story waiting to be told, a canvas for future generations. Yet, the arrival of European explorers was not a simple tale of discovery. It was a story intertwined with encounters, sometimes gentle, sometimes tragic. Indigenous nations met these strangers with curiosity, caution, and at times resistance. Gifts were exchanged, languages were learned, and knowledge was shared. But there were also misunderstandings, conflicts, and the spread of diseases that devastated populations. The frontier was not only a place of opportunity, it was a place of challenge where every interaction could shift the course of lives and communities. As explorers journeyed farther, they began to understand the geography of the land in new ways. Mountains were climbed to view the valleys below. Rivers were followed to their sources. Plains stretched endlessly, dotted with herds of bison, the shadows of clouds moving across the land in a dance of light and time. These observations, slow and deliberate, created the foundation of what would later be considered the American map. Each expedition, each diary entry, each sketch contributed to the growing awareness of a continent both vast and rich with life. The lives of explorers were often lonely, punctuated by moments of wonder and awe. Imagine standing on a hilltop as the sun rises over a river valley, the mists curling like smoke above the water. Imagine walking through forests where the only sounds are the wind in the trees and the distant cry of an eagle. These moments of quiet majesty were rewards for those who ventured into the unknown. They also brought reflections on human life, on the connection between people and the land, and on the fragile beauty of the world. Many explorers faced failure, yet each failure provided lessons for those who followed. Paths were discovered, rivers navigated, and settlements tested. Survival required patience, skill, and respect for the land and its inhabitants. Tools were essential: axes to clear trees, maps to guide journeys, compasses to find direction, and the wisdom of indigenous guides who knew the terrain better than any outsider. The frontier was both teacher and challenge, offering knowledge to those willing to listen. As the 17th century unfolded, exploration became more systematic. Colonies began to establish trade routes into the interior. Fur trading networks expanded, linking distant communities and introducing goods from Europe. Canoes carried pelts along rivers and across lakes, connecting villages, forts, and trading posts. Each voyage carried stories, news, and the growing understanding that the land was both a resource and a home, full of life and opportunity. Explorers also began to document the flora and fauna of the frontier. They described towering oaks, sprawling prairies, and plants that had never been seen in Europe. They wrote of deer, elk, and buffalo, of bears and wolves, and of birds whose songs filled the air. Each discovery was carefully recorded, contributing to a broader understanding of the natural world. The frontier was alive, a vibrant ecosystem that shaped the lives of all who entered it. Even in these early times, the frontier represented possibility. For some, it was wealth, gold, silver, or fertile land to farm. For others, it was freedom, a chance to escape the restrictions of established society. For many, it was simply the call of adventure, the desire to see what lay beyond the horizon. The land stretched endlessly, and with each step, explorers learned more about themselves, about human endurance, and about the resilience required to face the unknown. The legacy of these early explorers is complex. They paved the way for future settlement and expansion. They documented a world previously unknown to Europeans. Yet, their journeys also brought disruption, disease, and displacement to indigenous peoples. The frontier was never a single story. It was many stories intertwined, of discovery and loss, of courage and challenge, of people and the land. As we reflect on this time, it is important to remember the quiet moments as well as the grand events. The soft murmur of a river, the rustle of leaves in a forest, the distant howl of a wolf at night. These were the sounds that accompanied the first explorers. They moved slowly, with care, aware that they were part of a larger world, one that demanded respect and patience. In the grand tapestry of history, the early explorers of the American frontier occupy a vital thread. They were the first to cross great rivers, climb high mountains, and travel through endless plains. They were the first Europeans to witness the majesty of the land that would later become the United States. And though their journeys were often perilous and uncertain, their experiences created a foundation upon which the story of the frontier would continue to unfold. As the night grows deeper, we can imagine the explorers around campfires, the soft glow of flames illuminating maps and journals, the smell of wood smoke and earth filling the air. They spoke in whispers, shared stories of the day's discoveries, and planned the next day's journey. The wilderness stretched beyond them, vast and mysterious, full of challenges and beauty, and as we drift gently into sleep, we can carry with us the sense of wonder they felt, the connection to a land both wild and alive. The American frontier in its earliest days was not merely a place, it was an experience. It was a living, breathing world that demanded respect, courage, and curiosity. The explorers who ventured into it were shaped by the land as much as the land was shaped by their presence. Their journeys remind us that exploration is not just about maps and discoveries, but about observation, reflection, and a deep engagement with the world around us. And so, as we close our eyes and let the story settle softly in our minds, we remember the early explorers, not as conquerors, nor as simple travelers, but as witnesses to a vast, untamed world. A world that continues to inspire imagination, wonder, and dreams of wide, open spaces. Sleep now, and let the gentle whisper of rivers, the rustling of leaves, and the vast horizon carry you into a peaceful slumber, as the story of the American frontier unfolds quietly in your mind. As the first explorers returned from the vast, untamed wilderness of the American frontier, their tales of endless rivers, towering forests, and sweeping plains sparked the imaginations of people far across the Atlantic. The horizon that had once seemed distant and unknowable now called to families and individuals seeking a life of opportunity, freedom, and adventure. These early settlers embarked on journeys that would slowly, painstakingly, shape the landscape, culture, and history of a continent. The frontier was no simple or gentle place. To move westward meant to leave behind familiar towns, known roads, and the comforts of established life. Families loaded their belongings into sturdy wagons, often pulled by oxen or horses, and set off along narrow paths that wound through dense forests and across rivers that sometimes seemed impossible to cross. The journey itself was a test of endurance. Roads were few and maps were incomplete, leaving travelers to navigate through unknown terrain with both caution and courage. Each day presented new challenges. The weather could change abruptly, turning a sunny morning into a stormy afternoon. Rivers swelled unexpectedly, requiring fording or construction of makeshift rafts. Forests, though beautiful, could be perilous, filled with thorny underbrush, hidden sinkholes, or predatory animals. Yet, amidst these dangers, there was also awe. Sunlight filtering through the leaves of an ancient forest, deer grazing silently in a clearing, or the distant howl of wolves on a cold night. Each moment reminded settlers that they were part of a world far larger and older than themselves. Settlers were not alone in this endeavor. They often traveled in groups, forming small caravans for protection and companionship. Communities emerged slowly along the way, wherever a river offered water, fertile soil, and the promise of a permanent home. These early settlements were humble. Log cabins rose from cleared land, smoke curling from stone chimneys, gardens were planted, livestock tended, and wells dug to bring water from the earth. Life was harsh, but it was also filled with purpose and hope. The work of building a new life was never-ending. Fields had to be cleared of trees and rocks, soil tilled and fertilized, and crops planted in hopes of a successful harvest. Families labored from sunrise to sunset, learning to read the land, to anticipate weather patterns, and to care for animals that would provide food, labor, and companionship. Children often helped with chores, learning the skills they would need to survive and thrive in this vast, sometimes unforgiving land. Alongside these daily labors, settlers established the foundations of community. Schools were among the first buildings to appear where children could learn reading, writing, and arithmetic, and also the history of the lands they now inhabited. Churches were built as places of worship, gathering, and solace, offering spiritual guidance and comfort in a world that could be lonely and demanding. These institutions anchored communities, providing stability and shared values as families adapted to the frontier. Trade became an essential part of frontier life. Rivers and trails carried goods between settlements, connecting isolated families with distant towns. Furs, grains, and handmade tools were exchanged, while news traveled slowly along these same routes, carrying stories of successes, hardships, and discoveries. These networks of trade and communication allowed settlers to survive in a land that was often as wild as it was generous. The relationship between settlers and indigenous peoples was complex. At times, there was cooperation. Native nations shared knowledge of the land, taught settlers how to cultivate crops suited to the soil, and guided travelers through forests and across rivers. In other moments, tension and conflict arose as differing understandings of land ownership, resources, and sovereignty collided. These interactions shaped the lives of all involved, creating a frontier that was as much a social and cultural landscape as it was a physical one. The pace of expansion was slow but steady. Trails widened into roads, and small settlements grew into villages. These early communities were remarkably self-reliant. Blacksmiths forged tools and horseshoes, carpenters built homes and furniture, and farmers supplied food for neighbors near and far. Every individual played a role, contributing to the survival and growth of the community. And through all of this, the frontier continued to stretch outward, a vast canvas upon which settlers painted the beginnings of towns, farms, and eventually entire regions. As the 18th century progressed, the frontier became more than a place to survive. It became a place to dream. Stories of fertile valleys, abundant forests, and rivers rich with fish inspired more families to leave established settlements and seek a new life further west. These migrations were fueled by the hope of prosperity and the desire for freedom. For some, the frontier offered a chance to escape poverty or rigid social structures. For others, it promised adventure and the thrill of forging a life in an untamed world. The journey west was often measured not just in miles, but in the passage of seasons. Spring brought the planting of crops, summer the tending of fields, autumn the harvest, and winter the quiet, reflective months when families repaired homes, tended to animals, and prepared for the challenges to come. Life followed the rhythm of nature, with each year offering lessons in resilience, patience, and the rewards of hard work. Settlers were also keenly aware of the dangers that surrounded them. Disease could strike suddenly, and accidents were common. Storms could destroy homes, flood fields, or sweep away bridges and wagons. Wildlife, while beautiful, could be threatened. Wolves, bears, and other predators required caution and vigilance. Yet, within this constant challenge, there was also a profound sense of achievement. Every cleared field, every successful harvest, and every sturdy home was a testament to human determination and adaptability. religious and cultural traditions remained important anchors in the frontier. Families carried their beliefs with them, observing holidays and rituals, singing hymns, and gathering in small churches or homes for prayer and reflection. Music, storytelling, and communal gatherings provided comfort and continuity, linking the present with both past and future. In these moments, the harshness of frontier life was softened by human connection and shared experience. Education and literacy became gradually more important as settlements stabilized. Small schools, often held in a single room, taught children to read and write, preparing them to navigate both the practical and the intellectual challenges of life on the frontier. Learning was not confined to books. Children and adults alike absorbed knowledge from the land, from the patterns of weather, the behavior of animals, and the cycles of crops. In this way, the frontier was both a classroom and a living teacher, offering lessons in survival, observation, and wisdom. The expansion of the frontier was also marked by innovation and adaptation. Settlers developed new tools, techniques, and systems to cope with the demands of life in the wilderness. They learned to preserve food through smoking, salting, and canning. They discovered methods to irrigate fields, manage livestock, and store supplies for long winters. Each innovation was a small triumph over the uncertainty and difficulty of frontier life. Over time, some settlements began to grow into towns. These towns offered markets, blacksmiths, and inns, providing spaces where travelers and locals could meet, trade, and share news. Roads connected towns, facilitating movement and commerce. Postal services emerged, delivering letters and information that helped maintain connections across vast distances. Slowly, the frontier became a network of communities, each contributing to the larger story of expansion. Despite the challenges, settlers continued to move westward, motivated by both necessity and hope. The availability of fertile land, the promise of economic opportunity, and the desire for autonomy pushed families into territories that were often remote and difficult to access. Their journeys were slow and deliberate, marked by careful planning, resilience, and a willingness to confront uncertainty. Each step into the unknown was both a risk and a promise, a chance to create a life that was entirely their own. Life on the frontier was never entirely predictable. Droughts, floods, and storms could alter the landscape overnight. Disease could sweep through a community, taking both young and old, and yet the settlers persevered. They adapted to the land, learning from experience, observation, and guidance from neighbors and indigenous peoples. Through these challenges, they developed a deep understanding of the rhythms of the land and the cycles of life, knowledge that would serve them for generations. The frontier was also a place of cultural exchange. As settlers moved west, they encountered diverse indigenous nations, European settlers of various backgrounds, and other travelers seeking opportunity. Languages, traditions, and practices mingled in complex ways, influencing cuisine, farming techniques, trade practices, and even architecture. The frontier was, in many ways, a laboratory of human adaptation, where different ways of life met and coexisted, sometimes peacefully, sometimes with tension, but always leaving an imprint on the land and its communities. As decades passed, the settlers' efforts began to transform the landscape. Forests were cleared for fields, rivers were harnessed for mills, and homes and towns dotted the land. The frontier was slowly becoming familiar, mapped, and tamed, yet it never lost its sense of possibility. Each new settlement was a testament to human endurance, vision, and hope, carrying forward the legacy of those who first dared to venture into the unknown. And so, as the sun sets gently over the rolling plains, the rivers reflecting the soft glow of evening light, we can imagine the settlers resting after a long day's work. Children lie asleep in simple cabins, the air filled with the faint aroma of cooking fires and the soft sounds of livestock settling for the night. Adults speak quietly of the day's tasks and the plans for tomorrow, aware that life on the frontier is a delicate balance between effort and patience, between risk and reward. The story of the settlers and expansion of the American frontier is one of endurance, hope, and adaptation. It is the story of people who left behind the known for the unknown, who faced hardship with courage, and who built communities where there was once only wilderness. The frontier was both a place and an idea, a symbol of opportunity, challenge, and the enduring human spirit. As we drift into sleep, we can picture the wagons moving slowly along the trail, the smoke of distant chimneys curling into the sky, and the endless horizon stretching outward, full of possibility. We can feel the quiet determination of families working together, the shared laughter and conversation, and the peaceful rhythm of life that emerges from resilience and connection. The American frontier, in all its vastness, continues to inspire dreams of exploration, perseverance, and hope. Sleep now, and let the gentle narrative of the settlers carry you into calm and rest. Imagine the soft rustle of leaves, the flowing of distant rivers, and the golden light of dawn slowly illuminating cabins and fields. The frontier, vast and alive, holds stories that linger in the mind, soothing and expansive, as you drift deeper into slumber, wrapped in the endless possibilities of a land once wild and now forever part of history. As settlers pushed further into the vast expanse of the American frontier, the land itself seemed to stretch endlessly before them, full of promise and mystery. Yet, the frontier was not merely a landscape of opportunity. It was a place of collision, of encounters between people with different histories, cultures, and ways of life. The movement westward brought not only new settlements and towns, but also moments of tension, resistance, and profound transformation. In this chapter, we will explore the conflicts and changes that shaped the frontier, and how the land, its peoples, and the settlers adapted and endured through times of uncertainty. The first and most enduring conflicts arose between settlers and the indigenous nations who had lived on the land for centuries. These nations were diverse, each with its own language, customs, and territories. Some were nomadic, moving with the seasons to hunt, fish, and gather food, while others cultivated land along rivers and valleys, building villages and sustaining complex societies. For them, the arrival of settlers represented both curiosity and threat. They observed the newcomers carefully, sometimes offering guidance and trade, sometimes resisting encroachment. As settlements expanded, indigenous peoples often found their hunting grounds, fields, and sacred sites threatened. Treaties were negotiated in some cases, agreements meant to define boundaries and establish peace. Yet, these treaties were not always honored. Misunderstandings, broken promises, and differing concepts of land ownership led to tension and eventually to open conflict. For settlers, the land was a resource to be claimed, cultivated, and developed. For native nations, the land was a living, spiritual entity to be respected and shared. These differences in world view contributed to a series of encounters that would define the frontier experience for decades. Many conflicts were marked by both tragedy and heroism. Small skirmishes, raids, and battles occurred as communities defended themselves, their homes, and their resources. Settlers built forts and stockades for protection, and militias formed to provide security for expanding settlements. The frontier was often a place of uncertainty, where every day brought new challenges, and the line between survival and danger was thin. Yet, within this tension, there were also acts of diplomacy, negotiation, and cooperation. Some indigenous nations and settlers found ways to live side by side, trading goods, sharing knowledge, and learning from one another. Disease played a silent but devastating role, in this period of conflict and change. European settlers brought illnesses such as smallpox, influenza, and measles to which indigenous populations had little immunity. Epidemics spread rapidly, decimating communities and altering the balance of power on the frontier. The loss of life was profound, and the social and cultural impact was far-reaching. Families were torn apart, traditions were disrupted, and entire ways of life were challenged. The land itself seemed to witness both grief and resilience as communities struggled to recover and adapt. The arrival of settlers also altered the environment in significant ways. Forests were cleared for farms and towns, rivers were redirected for mills and irrigation, and animals were hunted in increasing numbers. The landscape changed under human hands, reflecting both the ingenuity and the ambition of those who sought to tame it. Yet, these changes were not always smooth or predictable. Nature responded in ways that tested settlers' skills and patience. Floods, droughts, and harsh winters could undo months of labor, reminding all who lived on the frontier that the land was powerful and enduring. As towns and settlements grew, so too did the social structures that defined life on the frontier. Schools, churches, and local governments emerged to provide stability and guidance. Yet, these structures often reflected the values and priorities of settlers, sometimes clashing with indigenous traditions and knowledge. Communities worked to establish order, develop trade, and maintain safety, but the frontier remained a dynamic, ever-changing environment where laws and customs were continuously negotiated and adapted. The expansion of transportation networks also brought both opportunity and conflict. Roads, rivers, and eventually railroads connected distant settlements, allowing for the movement of goods, people, and information. These routes facilitated trade, enabled communication, and encouraged further settlement, yet they also brought more settlers into areas that were previously remote, intensifying conflicts over land and resources. The frontier became a place of constant negotiation, where the ambitions of newcomers intersected with the rights and traditions of those who had long called the land home. Cultural encounters on the frontier were not limited to conflicts. They were also moments of exchange and adaptation. Settlers learned agricultural techniques, hunting methods, and survival skills from indigenous peoples. Indigenous nations adopted tools, trade goods, and knowledge introduced by settlers. Over time, these interactions shaped the way people lived, worked, and thought about the land. The frontier was a place of learning as much as it was a place of struggle, a space where human ingenuity met the vast possibilities of the natural world. Within these dynamics, the frontier became a stage for both individual and collective acts of courage. Families defended their homes, communities negotiated peace, and individuals ventured into unknown territories to map rivers, explore valleys, and document the landscapes around them. These acts of endurance and adaptation were foundational to the evolving story of the American frontier. Each day brought small victories, a successful harvest, a repaired bridge, a negotiated treaty. Each day also brought reminders of vulnerability and uncertainty, emphasizing the delicate balance between human ambition and the natural world. The 19th century brought new dimensions to the conflicts and changes on the frontier. As settlers moved further west, the pressure on indigenous lands intensified. Government policies, land surveys, and legal frameworks attempted to organize and regulate the expansion. Some policies encouraged relocation, creating designated territories for indigenous nations, while others sought to assimilate indigenous peoples into settler society. These efforts were met with varying degrees of resistance, adaptation, and negotiation, shaping the social and political landscape of the frontier. The frontier was also transformed economically during this period. Agriculture expanded, with settlers cultivating increasingly larger areas of land for crops and livestock. Trade networks grew more complex, linking frontier communities with markets in established towns and cities. Mining booms, particularly in the Western Territories, brought waves of settlers in search of wealth and opportunity. Towns sprang up almost overnight, creating hubs of commerce, social life, and cultural exchange. The economic development of the frontier was inseparable from the conflicts and changes that accompanied settlement, as every new opportunity carried both promise and challenge. Technological advancements also influenced life on the frontier. The introduction of firearms, plows, and later mechanized equipment changed the ways settlers farmed, defended themselves, and traveled. Communication technologies such as the telegraph allowed information to travel faster, linking remote settlements with the wider world. These innovations facilitated expansion, yet they also created new forms of competition, conflict, and adaptation, reshaping the landscape and the experiences of those who lived within it. Social life on the frontier was shaped by both adversity and community. Gatherings, celebrations, and shared labor created bonds between neighbors, helping to sustain morale and reinforce social cohesion. Music, storytelling, and religious observances offered comfort and continuity, while practical cooperation, such as barn raisings, harvest festivals, and defense patrols, ensured survival in a challenging environment. The frontier was a place where human resilience was constantly tested, yet where community and shared purpose offered strength and support. As conflicts unfolded, individuals on the frontier developed strategies for negotiation, compromise, and coexistence. Diplomacy between settlers and indigenous nations took many forms, from formal treaties to informal agreements. Understanding the land, its resources, and the social dynamics of both settlers and indigenous communities became essential for survival. Knowledge, patience, and respect were as important as physical strength and labor, highlighting the complex and nuanced nature of frontier life. Through all of these challenges, change was constant. Forests became farmland, trading posts evolved into towns, and small communities expanded into bustling settlements. The frontier itself was shaped not only by human activity, but by the ongoing interplay of people, land, and nature. Rivers carved new paths, seasons shifted, and communities adapted, reflecting the dynamic and fluid character of life on the edge of civilization. Even as conflict persisted, the frontier inspired creativity, innovation, and a sense of possibility. Settlers experimented with new crops, constructed innovative homes, and developed systems for irrigation, transportation, and trade. Artistic expression, storytelling, and cultural traditions flourished, reflecting both the challenges and the beauty of frontier life. The frontier was not merely a site of struggle, it was a space of imagination, learning, and growth. By the mid-19th century, the dynamics of conflict and change had begun to shift. Railroads and other infrastructure connected distant regions, facilitating movement and commerce while also intensifying settlement pressures. Indigenous nations faced increasing displacement, and settlers navigated more complex social, economic, and political landscapes. The frontier was still wild, still full of uncertainty, but it was also becoming more integrated, more structured, and more interconnected. The stories of this era are filled with both heroism and tragedy. Families endured long winters, harsh landscapes, and the challenges of isolation. Communities negotiated treaties, established schools, and built homes from the materials the land offered. Indigenous nations adapted, resisted, and persisted despite enormous pressures. Every day on the frontier was a negotiation between survival, opportunity, and respect for the land and its inhabitants. As we reflect on this chapter of history, it is important to recognize the complexity of the frontier experience. Conflict and change were inseparable from expansion, yet they were also intertwined with cooperation, learning, and adaptation. The frontier was a place of contrasts, danger and beauty, hardship and hope, loss and resilience. Every story of struggle was accompanied by a story of endurance, every act of conflict by an act of compromise or diplomacy. As night falls over the vast landscapes of the frontier, we can imagine the quiet moments that punctuated daily life. Campfires burned softly outside cabins and forts, rivers flow gently under moonlight, and the wind rustles through the trees. Settlers, indigenous families, and travelers alike pause to rest, reflect, and prepare for the next day. The land itself seems to breathe with them, a witness to both struggle and adaptation, shaping the rhythm of life on the frontier. The legacy of conflict and change on the American frontier is enduring. It is the story of resilience, adaptation, and the interplay between people and the land. It reminds us that history is never simple, that progress often comes with challenges, and that every journey into the unknown carries both risk and opportunity. The frontier was a crucible of experience, forging communities, shaping cultures, and leaving an imprint on the land that continues to inspire imagination, reflection, and understanding. Sleep now and let the story of the frontier's conflicts and changes drift through your mind. Picture the gentle flow of rivers, the silhouettes of trees against the twilight sky, and the quiet determination of families building homes and communities in a world both wild and beautiful. The frontier, in all its complexity, offers a story of endurance, hope, and transformation. Let these tales of courage, adaptation, and change carry you into a calm and restful sleep, where the vast landscapes and endless possibilities of the American frontier unfold softly in your dreams. The American frontier, by the 19th century, had begun to take on a character that was uniquely recognizable to those who would come to call it the Wild West. The frontier was no longer merely a stretch of unclaimed wilderness. It had become a landscape of cattle trails, gold rush towns, and isolated settlements, where the rhythm of life was shaped by both the demands of survival and the thrill of opportunity. The era of the cowboys, the outlaws, and the wide-open plains emerged as a symbol of both adventure and endurance, a period of history that continues to capture the imagination of dreamers and wanderers alike. In the vast plains and rolling hills of the American West, the cattle industry grew to define much of the frontier economy. Longhorns, brought from Europe and adapted to the land, roamed freely across open ranges. Ranchers, often managing thousands of cattle, faced the challenge of guiding their herds across thousands of miles of rugged terrain to reach markets, railheads, or local towns. It was a life defined by work, patience, and skill, requiring not only strength but an intimate understanding of the land, the weather, and the animals themselves. The cowboys were the heart of this industry, the individuals who rode the range with courage, precision, and endurance. They were responsible for rounding up herds, driving cattle across trails that stretched for hundreds of miles, and protecting livestock from predators and rustlers. Life on the trail was long and arduous, filled with challenges that tested both the body and spirit. Yet it was also a life of freedom, of connection to nature, and of a deep understanding of the rhythms of the land. Cattle drives were a central feature of this era. Cowboys, often working in teams, guided herds along famous trails such as the Kishom Trail or the Goodnight Loving Trail. These journeys could last for weeks, with cowboys sleeping under the stars and riding from dawn to dusk. Each day presented new challenges, rivers to cross, weather to endure, and the ever-present risk of stampedes or illness in the herd. Yet, amidst these hardships, there was a sense of camaraderie and shared purpose. The trail became a classroom, teaching skills in horsemanship, navigation, and problem-solving, as well as lessons in resilience, patience, and trust. The towns that emerged along the trails were lively, bustling centers of trade, social life, and entertainment. Saloons, general stores, and hotels provided spaces where cowboys could rest, trade goods, and share stories of the road. These towns also became hubs of commerce, connecting the remote frontier to larger markets and cities. The architecture was often simple yet functional, built to withstand the harsh conditions of the West while providing shelter and space for community interaction. Life in these towns was a balance between work and leisure, discipline and adventure, routine and unpredictability. Mining was another defining aspect of the Wild West. The discovery of gold, silver, and other valuable minerals brought waves of prospectors and settlers seeking wealth and opportunity. Mining towns sprang up almost overnight, with tents, cabins, and temporary structures dotting the landscape. These towns were filled with a sense of possibility and excitement, yet they were also places of uncertainty and risk. Miners faced harsh conditions, limited resources, and the constant threat of accidents. Despite these challenges, the mining communities developed their own social networks, traditions, and culture, leaving a lasting imprint on the identity of the frontier. The Wild West was also home to outlaws, lawmen, and the complex dynamics of justice in a land where formal institutions were often scarce. Stories of sheriffs, marshals, and vigilantes became intertwined with tales of robbers, bandits, and gunfighters. The frontier demanded resourcefulness, courage, and an understanding of human nature. Lawmen maintained order as best they could, while communities relied on collective action, local customs, and personal responsibility to navigate the challenges of crime and conflict. These dynamics created a landscape where danger and adventure were ever present, and where reputation, honor, and skill could define the trajectory of one's life. The cowboys themselves came from diverse backgrounds, bringing different experiences, cultures, and traditions to the frontier. Many were young men seeking adventure, independence, or escape from past hardships. Others were seasoned workers with years of experience managing livestock and navigating the land. Indigenous peoples, African Americans, and immigrants from various countries also contributed to the labor and culture of the cowboy lifestyle, enriching the frontier with diverse perspectives, skills, and stories. The cowboy became a symbol not just of work, but of resilience, adaptability, and the human capacity to thrive in challenging environments. Life on the frontier was deeply intertwined with nature. Cowboys and settlers alike observed the movements of animals, the patterns of weather, and the rhythms of the seasons to guide their work and ensure survival. The land dictated the pace of life, demanding respect, patience, and attentiveness. Rivers, mountains, and plains were not merely obstacles to be overcome. They were partners in the daily dance of survival, providing resources, inspiration, and lessons that shaped both practical skills and philosophical understanding. Storytelling and legend were central to life in the Wild West. Tales of heroism, adventure, and cunning were shared around campfires, in saloons, and along trails. These stories served not only as entertainment, but as a means of transmitting values, wisdom, and cautionary lessons. They celebrated bravery, ingenuity, and perseverance, while also acknowledging the dangers and uncertainties inherent in frontier life. Over time, these narratives became part of the broader mythology of the American West, shaping how generations would remember and imagine the frontier. The frontier also fostered innovation and adaptation. Settlers and cowboys developed tools, techniques, and practices suited to the unique challenges of the West. Barbed wire transformed fencing and land management, allowing ranchers to protect livestock and define property. Advances in transportation, including stagecoaches and railroads, connected distant settlements and facilitated commerce. Mining technology improved efficiency and safety, while agricultural methods evolved to suit the arid and variable climate of the plains. Each innovation reflected human ingenuity in response to the demands of a challenging environment. Social life in the Wild West was shaped by both necessity and creativity. Communities organized events, dances, and gatherings to foster connection and provide relief from the hardships of daily labor. Music, storytelling, and shared meals created bonds that reinforced social cohesion. Religious observances and cultural traditions offered comfort and continuity, linking individuals to broader networks of faith, heritage, and identity. Life in these communities was a blend of labor, leisure, and cultural expression, where human connection was as vital as skill and endurance. As the 19th century progressed, railroads played an increasingly central role in shaping the frontier. They facilitated the movement of goods, people, and information, connecting remote regions to larger cities and markets. Railroads allowed ranchers to transport cattle more efficiently, miners to move ore to processing centers, and settlers to access supplies and services. The arrival of trains also accelerated settlement, creating new towns and transforming existing communities. While the railroads brought opportunity and growth, they also intensified conflicts over land, resources, and sovereignty, adding new layers of complexity to frontier life. Law, order, and justice on the frontier were ever-present concerns. Towns and communities relied on local sheriffs, marshals, and volunteer militias to maintain security. Vigilance and self-reliance were necessary traits for anyone navigating the risks of the West. Yet, amidst these challenges, communities developed systems of cooperation, dispute resolution, and social norms that provided structure and guidance. The balance between freedom and regulation, risk and responsibility, defined much of the social fabric of the Wild West. The landscape itself continued to shape life in profound ways. Rivers provided water and transportation, forests offered timber and shelter, and plains offered grazing land for cattle. Yet, these same features could pose challenges. Floods, droughts, and wildfires tested resilience and planning. Predators threatened livestock, and harsh winters could isolate communities for weeks. Living in harmony with the land required observation, adaptation, and a deep respect for its power and unpredictability. Education and literacy gradually became part of frontier life. Schools were established in towns and settlements, providing instruction in reading, writing, and arithmetic, as well as lessons in civics and history. Knowledge was also transmitted informally through apprenticeship, mentoring, and storytelling. Practical skills, horsemanship, navigation, survival, and livestock management were valued as highly as book learning. The frontier was a place of continuous education, where the land itself served as both teacher and guide. The era of cowboys and the Wild West was a time of cultural blending as well. Indigenous traditions, immigrant customs, and settler practices mingled to create new forms of music, cuisine, clothing, and art. Foodways evolved to suit the demands of frontier life, combining available resources with culinary techniques from diverse communities. Clothing, tools, and housing reflected both practicality and cultural heritage. In these adaptations, the frontier became a laboratory of human creativity, ingenuity, and resilience. As towns matured, commerce and industry flourished. General stores, blacksmiths, and trade centers provided essential goods and services. Banks, post offices, and newspapers linked communities to wider economic and social networks. These institutions offered stability and continuity, supporting both daily life and long-term growth. The frontier, once defined by uncertainty and isolation, gradually became a landscape of interconnected towns, markets, and communities, each shaped by the rhythms of work, nature, and human ambition. Despite the growing infrastructure, life in the Wild West retained a sense of unpredictability and adventure. The vastness of the plains, the remoteness of mountains, and the changing conditions of weather ensured that no day was entirely predictable. Storms could arrive suddenly, altering travel plans and threatening livestock. Rivers could flood or dry, reshaping trails and access routes. In these conditions, skill, observation, and adaptability were essential, and those who thrived were those who understood both the possibilities and limitations of the land. As the era of cowboys and the Wild West drew toward its later years, the frontier remained a symbol of freedom, opportunity, and challenge. The myths and realities of this period, long cattle drives, mining booms, lawmen, and outlaws, continue to inspire stories, films, and dreams. Yet beneath the legend lies a rich tapestry of human experience, the labor, creativity, courage, and adaptation that allowed people to survive, thrive, and shape a land that was vast, unpredictable, and alive. As night falls over the rolling plains, the soft rustle of prairie grasses, the distant cry of coyotes, and the gentle flow of rivers create a lullaby for those who once walked the trails. Cowboys rest by campfires, towns grow quiet under the glow of lanterns, and the land itself seems to exhale, a living witness to both struggle and triumph. In this serene moment, the stories of the Wild West, the courage, the endurance, the daily rhythms of work and rest, carry gently into our minds, creating a calm, expansive space for reflection, imagination, and sleep. And so, as you close your eyes and drift into the quiet of night, imagine the vast horizons stretching endlessly, the horses grazing peacefully under a sky filled with stars, and the gentle murmur of life across the plains. The era of cowboys and the Wild West reminds us that adventure, resilience, and connection with the land are timeless, and that even in the harshest conditions, beauty, ingenuity, and hope can flourish. Sleep now and let the wide-open landscapes, the distant trails, and the enduring spirit of the frontier guide you into a peaceful, restorative slumber, where the story of the Wild West unfolds softly in your dreams. The story of the American frontier is vast, stretching across centuries of exploration, settlement, conflict, and adaptation. By the late 19th century, a profound transformation was underway. The frontier, once a vast and unbroken wilderness filled with possibilities and challenges, was slowly drawing to a close. Lands that had seemed endless and untamed were now dotted with towns, farms, railroads, and communities. The raw, wild expanses that had defined the early frontier were giving way to a more settled, organized, and interconnected society. This chapter will guide you through the final phase of the frontier's story, the closing of a chapter in the history of a nation, and the enduring legacy it left behind. The closing of the frontier was not an abrupt event. It was a gradual process shaped by the steady movement of settlers, the growth of towns, the expansion of transportation networks, and the establishment of legal and governmental structures. Land that had once been wild and sparsely populated became cultivated, surveyed, and claimed. Farms spread across the plains, railroads linked distant regions, and towns expanded into small cities. With each new settlement, the frontier receded, transforming from a symbol of endless opportunity into a more structured and familiar landscape. The United States Census Bureau famously declared the frontier closed in 1890, signaling that there was no longer a clear line dividing settled from unsettled land. By this point, the vast stretches of prairie, mountains, and valleys that had once defined the edge of civilization were now integrated into the growing network of communities across the continent. Yet, the declaration of the frontier's closure was not just a measurement of land. It marked the end of an era, an epoch defined by exploration, independence, and the raw, unpredictable encounters between humans and the untamed land. The factors that contributed to the closing of the frontier were numerous. Railroads played a pivotal role, connecting towns, facilitating trade, and enabling settlers to access regions that had previously been remote and difficult to reach. With transportation more reliable, land could be developed on a scale previously unimaginable. Croplands expanded, towns grew into cities, and industries flourished. The physical accessibility of the land was mirrored by legal frameworks, including land grants, homesteading acts, and property regulations, which formalized settlement and ownership. The Homestead Act, for instance, allowed individuals and families to claim parcels of land for farming, provided they lived on it and cultivated it. This policy encouraged thousands of settlers to move west, cultivate the land, and contribute to the growing network of communities. The act was both an opportunity and a challenge, requiring hard work, resilience, and adaptability. Families faced the harsh realities of frontier life, unpredictable weather, isolation, and the labor-intensive demands of farming in a landscape that could be both generous and unforgiving. Yet it also offered hope, the possibility of building a life of independence and self-sufficiency. As the frontier closed, the lives of indigenous peoples were profoundly affected. The lands they had inhabited, stewarded, and traveled for centuries were increasingly claimed by settlers. Many indigenous nations were relocated to reservations, often under conditions of coercion or forced agreement. These relocations disrupted traditional ways of life, social structures, and cultural practices. Despite these challenges, indigenous communities demonstrated remarkable resilience, preserving their languages, traditions, and knowledge, and adapting to the changing realities of the frontier. The closing of the frontier also brought changes to the economy and society. Agriculture, mining, ranching, and trade became more organized and regulated. Markets expanded, and the growing infrastructure allowed communities to specialize and diversify. Towns and small cities became hubs of commerce, education, and culture. Social institutions, schools, churches, local governments provided structure and stability. Life, while still challenging in many respects, became more predictable and integrated into the broader fabric of American society. Cultural life evolved alongside economic and social changes. Communities celebrated festivals, holidays, and local traditions, maintaining a sense of continuity even as the landscape itself transformed. Music, storytelling, and art reflected both the experiences of frontier life and the aspirations of a more settled society. The frontier's legacy of resilience, adaptability, and creativity continued to influence cultural expression, shaping the identity of a nation moving into the 20th century. Technology and innovation played a crucial role in the frontier's closing. Mechanized farming equipment increased efficiency, railroads accelerated the movement of goods and people, and communication networks connected remote communities. These advances allowed settlers to cultivate larger areas of land, engage in trade more effectively, and access information and services previously unavailable. The integration of technology into daily life reshaped both the physical and social landscape, signaling a new era of productivity, connectivity, and possibility. Despite the closure of the frontier, the spirit of exploration and adventure persisted. People continued to move, explore, and innovate, even within the more settled framework of the late 19th century. Railroads opened new territories, mining towns emerged in previously untouched regions, and communities adapted to changing economic and social conditions. The frontier was no longer an unbroken wilderness, but its influence, its lessons, stories, and ethos remained deeply embedded in the culture, imagination, and identity of the nation. The environmental impact of frontier settlement was significant. Forests were cleared, rivers diverted, and wildlife populations altered. The land was reshaped by human activity, reflecting both ambition and adaptation. Yet, even as the landscape changed, the natural rhythms of seasons, weather, and geography continued to influence life on the frontier. Settlers learned to work with the land, understanding patterns of rainfall, soil fertility, and animal behavior. This knowledge, accumulated through experience and observation, became part of the enduring wisdom of the frontier. The closing of the frontier also redefined social relationships. Communities became more interconnected, trade networks expanded, and institutions provided stability. Education became increasingly accessible, with schools offering instruction in literacy, arithmetic, and practical skills. Religious and civic organizations fostered social cohesion, reinforcing values, norms, and a sense of collective responsibility. The frontier's transition from wild to settled territory created new opportunities for collaboration, governance, and cultural exchange. As towns and cities grew, they preserved the memory of the frontier while also adapting to new realities. Historical societies, museums, and local traditions commemorated the experiences of pioneers, cowboys, settlers, and indigenous peoples. Stories of cattle drives, gold rushes, and exploration were passed down, preserving the ethos of independence, courage, and resilience that had defined the frontier. Even as the physical frontier receded, its influence persisted in literature, art, and national identity. The closing of the frontier also marked a shift in identity for the nation as a whole. The frontier had shaped notions of independence, self-reliance, and opportunity. As settlement expanded, these ideals were carried into emerging cities, industries, and social institutions. The ethos of the frontier, its spirit of exploration, adaptability, and courage, became a defining characteristic of American culture, influencing politics, economics, and cultural narratives for generations to come. Personal stories of settlers highlight the human dimension of the frontier's closing. Families who had moved west in search of opportunity endured hardships, celebrated successes, and contributed to the formation of communities. They built homes, cultivated fields, raised children, and established institutions that would endure long after the frontier itself had closed. Their experiences illustrate the resilience, creativity, and determination required to thrive in a land that was both demanding and generous. Indigenous experiences during this period also illuminate the complexity of the frontier's transformation. Communities faced displacement, negotiation, and adaptation. Many maintained cultural practices, storytelling, and traditional knowledge, even while navigating new realities imposed by settlement and government policies. The frontier's closing was both a challenge and a catalyst for the preservation, adaptation, and evolution of indigenous culture, highlighting resilience in the face of profound change. Environmental adaptation remained central to life as the frontier closed. Settlers learned to cope with the extremes of weather, the variability of soil fertility, and the challenges of irrigation. Techniques for crop rotation, soil preservation, and water management were developed, allowing communities to sustain agriculture in diverse and sometimes unpredictable conditions. This knowledge, rooted in observation and experience, contributed to the long-term sustainability of settlements and the ongoing relationship between humans and the land. The closing of the frontier also created opportunities for reflection and memory. Communities commemorated events, preserved landmarks, and passed down stories of exploration, settlement, and challenge. These narratives served as a bridge between the past and the present, allowing future generations to understand the complexities, achievements, and hardships of frontier life. The frontier became both a historical record and a source of inspiration, shaping identity, culture, and collective memory. Social and economic networks evolved as communities became more established. Markets, trade routes, and communication systems facilitated the exchange of goods, services, and information. Settlements that had once been isolated were increasingly connected, creating regional and national networks. These connections reinforced stability, encouraged growth, and allowed for coordinated responses to challenges such as drought, disease, and conflict. The frontier's closing was, in part, the result of these growing networks of interdependence, cooperation, and shared knowledge. Even as the frontier closed, the ethos of independence and self-reliance remained. Settlers and communities continued to innovate, adapt, and navigate the challenges of life in a changing landscape. The lessons of endurance, observation, and ingenuity that had been cultivated over generations of exploration and settlement persisted, shaping cultural identity and social practices. The frontier's influence extended beyond its physical boundaries, embedding itself in the imagination, values, and aspirations of a nation. By the turn of the 20th century, the American frontier was largely a memory, a collection of stories, experiences, and landscapes that had been transformed by human activity. Railroads, towns, farms, and cities marked the land once defined by wilderness and possibility. Yet the frontier's legacy endured, preserved in literature, art, music, and folklore. Its stories of exploration, struggle, courage, and adaptation continued to inspire, reminding future generations of the enduring human spirit and the vast, intricate, and beautiful landscapes of the American West. As night falls over the fields, towns, and plains, we can imagine the quiet moments of reflection. Families rest after a day of labor. Children sleep peacefully in homes built through perseverance, and the land itself breathes softly under the moonlight. The stories of pioneers, settlers, cowboys, miners, and indigenous peoples drift gently through the air, weaving a tapestry of history that is both expansive and intimate. Sleep now, and let the story of the frontier's closing carry you into calm and rest. Picture the vast horizons, the rivers flowing quietly, the forests standing tall, and the plains stretching endlessly under a sky full of stars. The American frontier, in its final phase, offers lessons of resilience, adaptability, hope, and connection to the land, to each other, and to the stories that shape our shared history. Let these images, rhythms, and tales guide you into a deep, restorative slumber where the spirit of the frontier lingers softly in your dreams. And so, as we drift toward the end of our journey tonight, remember that the American frontier was not just land. It was a story of courage, change, and hope, a story that shaped a nation and continues to inspire. Sleep now and dream of the wide open plains, the mountains that touch the sky, and the endless possibilities of adventure. Good night.